Thank you very much, Michael. We'll move right into the next panel on creating global connectivity for refugees. In 2010, violence flared in the Côte d'Ivoire following a presidential election, and refugees fled to several different countries, including Liberia. I was with UNHCR at the time, and UNHCR provided emergency relief and then began to set up camps removed from the border, which is what the usual practice is not to leave refugee camps on the border where most of the refugees had settled. Most of the refugees did not leave the border settlements, would not go to the camps for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons happened to have been that the connectivity for their phones reached the settlements just over the border for their Ivorian phones, but they wouldn't have been connected to those networks had they moved into the camps. When I heard that, I knew we were living in a different world than we had grown up in terms of thinking about refugees. To help us think about connectivity, we have a great panel. I'll just give you their titles so as not to waste time. Their biographies are in the on the app that you have on your mobile phones. So Kelly Clements, United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees; Hans Vestberg, UN Foundation board member and former CEO of Ericsson; Niraj Singh, Global Head of International Public Sector at Vodafone Global Enterprise; Garry Conille, Undersecretary General, Programs and Operations Digital at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies; and Blair Levin, Non-Resident Senior Fellow at Brookings Institute and former Executive Director of the U.S. National Broadband Plan Team. So I will ask each of the panelists a couple of questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time for broader discussion after that. So Kelly, let me start with you and ask you what your view is, UNHCR's view is, on the importance of connectivity to refugees.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I have to say, delighted to be here first, but your story about the situation in Liberia reminded me of a visit to northern Rakhine State, where we got great connectivity based thanks to Bangladesh in terms of being able to download messages at that time. So from the UNHCR perspective, obviously, I don't think there would be a person in this room that is not thinking about the images of last year in terms of the Europe crisis and how very much connected people were on the move to their devices or to social media to identify safe routes, to identify places where either borders were open or there were increasing restrictions and they needed to choose another route. This obviously it was the fastest way for people on the move to be able to identify what their choices were and where they were going to go next. And is probably the most real indication as to why connectivity when it comes to refugees or migrants is incredibly important, and especially right now. We know that refugees, for example, have only 50% have access to phones that have an internet connection at this point. However, refugees also, only 7% are in areas that don't have that kind of access to digital technology. So we are undertaking a pretty major initiative, Refugee Connectivity Project, which, if I can just tout my predecessor, happened when he was in my job, to try, in fact, to make this available for a number of reasons. It improves service delivery. It empowers people to make their own choices. It enables us as service providers or those that are trying to undertake a real-time feedback mechanism with the people that we are serving to make sure that what is available is what refugees need and want, and so that they are driving the decision-making as opposed to the other way around. For these various reasons, we're embarking on a 5-year strategy to try to bring connectivity to 90% of the refugee population.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. You actually answered the second question I was going to ask you, and very efficient, so I will move to Hans Vestberg. Hans, at the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in May, Ericsson announced the development of the emergency wallet, I think it was called, for victims of humanitarian crises. Can you tell us a bit about the project, with whom it was developed, and where you are in terms of rollout?
Thank you. First of all, I tend to agree 100% with the previous speaker. I mean, we have a technology revolution that is ongoing and is going extremely quick. And the only thing that I can promise that whatever technology revolution you have seen so far, meaning how many people has a smartphone, etc., has been slow. The next 5 years is a tremendous change on the connectivity and the price on smartphones. And we estimate in the latest report that 2021, 90% of the Earth population will have broadband coverage, very much as it was said previously. So this is the 21st century's infrastructure when it comes to build efficient solutions quickly, built on mobility, broadband, and cloud services. I think that we need to realize. It's not the answer to everything in a humanitarian crisis, of course not. But it's clearly an enabler and a tool that is enormously important to use. When it comes to the emergency wallet, for example, that is, I would say, a typical example how we need to work. I mean, it's a work between a private company. It's a foundation, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's a product that is actually commercial. We sell to commercial companies as well. And what it's doing is, of course, is seeing that money being sent safely to the humanitarian workers in field, which has hard time to get the money. And I think this is just the first start, of course. In the next step, it can be refugees getting the money, given how many phones there's going to be there. And just imagine how efficient it will be just to transport the money. And secondly, we're knowing that it will get in the right hands and not getting in hands that it should get in. This can, of course, be applied to many other solutions as well. This is just one way of thinking that many of the UN organizations need to use ICT to be more efficient in their operation. And I think that's what we have learned. I mean, Ericsson has worked with the Ericsson Response, which is the humanitarian response for 15 years. We've done the emergency wallet. We're doing Refugee United together with some Danish brothers. What you have learned over time is that how difficult it is to work to deploy resources, because philanthropy is not for many, I would say for many private companies, but doing it sort of with resources and the people to be part of solving these big problems. I would say any company would do that today, and the awareness has gone up dramatically since the SDGs was launched last year, and many private companies would like to be part of it, and we heard in the previous panel as well. So I think that's where I'm coming from.
So if I could just follow that with a question. You mentioned that this is a commercial activity
Yes.
for Ericsson, but also with the support of the Gates Foundation. So it's very interesting, philanthropic, commercial, and then also with the public sector as well, with the Refugee Support Agency. So how does that work? How did that come together? How can that be a model for other kinds of partnerships to be put together?
What we in the company Ericsson, we basically have we have 4 ways of measuring our business: financials, employees, customers, and society. And actually, in the society target, we have the 17 SDGs. And how we can support them. And we have an organization that looks what type of commercial products do we have that we can deploy to support the 17 SDGs. And it was pretty simple when they came up with we have a mobile wallet that we sell to carriers like Vodafone and others all around the world, where I think we have some 50 different implementation. That can be used for humanitarian work as well. And then, of course, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they think that is a good cause, so they found that we can deploy it there. But it's a commercial product, and it's what we're doing in daily work, and that's what is simple and how it works.
Thank you. Niraj, if I can move to you. I know that Vodafone has sponsored, I think, what you call instant network classrooms with UNHCR in refugee camps. Can you tell us what these are, if you know how many kids have benefited, and what you think about the importance of connectivity to refugee children and refugees in general?
Sure, thank you. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a panel speaker. Much appreciated. So, you know, if you look at the panel speakers all morning, education has been a key theme. And you know, one of the big focus at Vodafone was how do we use our technology to benefit education, especially in the refugee camps. So actually, this started as a partnership with UNHCR, and the first one we deployed was in Kenya in the Dadaab and Kakuma camps, which are the largest African refugee camps. what this is actually a hardened box that has 25 tablets in it. It has a laptop, a projector, a Wi-Fi router, and a battery. And this box is hardened so it can be wheeled anywhere, thrown in the back of a truck. And basically what it looks for is a connectivity through 3G, which we provide, of course, as a service provider. And then through the laptop, you can actually download any lesson you want. So the reason we partnered with UNHCR is they provided the teachers, the training. And then to give you an example, and I was in one of these classrooms in Dabab, there are kids, this camp has been around for 20 years. There are kids there who are now teenagers who've never left that few square kilometers. So they have no idea what the outside world looks like. But with this technology and the education through tablets, they have now access to any education that any other kid in any country have. So for example, there are lessons that are put out by MIT. These guys are learning that. These kids were learning Shakespeare on that tablet. So it was amazing to see kids in Dabab could actually recite Shakespeare and talk about technology that MIT is talking about. So that's what this technology has done. And again, it was a partnership between us and UNHCR. How many kids have benefited? It's now deployed in 23 schools across 4 countries, so DRC, South Sudan, Kenya, and Tanzania. And every month, 30,000 kids and about 600 teachers benefit by this. And our goal is by 2020 to educate 3 million children in the refugee camps using this technology.
That's great. We just hope that there aren't 3 million children in refugee camps at that point. But that's really wonderful. Per Hegenes, at the end of the last session, his one lesson was that foundations and private actors should understand that the UN operates on different timelines sometimes than the private sector. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the challenges and the opportunities of Vodafone's work with UN organizations, UNHCR, WP. I know you've worked with other organizations. How does that fit into the private sector model? How do you square that circle or something?
So some of this has already been addressed, but I need to draw a distinction between, in the private world, every private company, mostly, especially large company like ourselves, have a foundation, and then there's a commercial arm. And the relationship with any UN agency or NGOs is twofold. One is with the foundation, which is more on a partnership basis, and it's about, so for example, this whole classroom in a box was created as a foundation initiative. But then there's the commercial arm. And at times the lines tend to get blurred in the eyes of the UN agencies, not in us. We have a great Chinese wall between us, and we draw the distinction. So, if you look at commercial organizations like us, typically we are tuned to working fairly nimble in days and months. When you get to the NGOs and the UN world, you're talking, months rolling into 6 months, into 9 months. So the timelines are much different. Also, the procurement rules are very different. And when you start engaging with any UN agency for a commercial activity, they typically put the procurement arm in front of you as opposed to the program arm, and trying to figure out how do we work in partnership to develop a program before you get to the procurement. So there are challenges like these. It's not unsurmountable. We've recently done a big project, a commercial project with one of the UN agencies, and alluding to what Hans was saying, using our M-Pesa platform, which is a mobile gateway, to actually bring mobile. So what this UN agency wanted to do was give some monetary benefits to the beneficiaries, but they couldn't figure out because there was no banking infrastructure in the camps. But guess what? There were mobile phones with these refugees. So how do you actually use the mobile phone to disperse money? And not only disperse money, but then how do you use it in the ecosystem with the retailers and stuff like that? So that's a great ecosystem that we've created with a UN agency recently.
So you raise an interesting point on the procurement rules, and I won't pose this question, but just to put a thought for the Deputy High Commissioner here is it possible to imagine kind of joint projects done or joint ventures between the private sector and UNHCR, another UN organization, that could be set up in a way that wouldn't go through the procurement rules, but rather would be an operation done with the organization itself being part of the production? And maybe save that for another time. But I know that I've seen this in other places where the procurement rules can slow things down by several years. And often the people who develop a project then aren't even allowed to bid on the project, and it can create real obstacles. Okay, let me move to Garry. Garry, I understand that IFRC has developed with IBM an app you call the Virtual Volunteer. Can you tell us a bit about that and when you expect that'll be put into operation and where? And thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alexander. Let me quickly recognize the presence of Lars Wig from IBM, who's here with me, in case anybody wants to know a lot about the technical details. You know, the Red Cross movement comes from a very unique perspective because we're present in the communities through our 17 million volunteers, where really throughout the migration, the routes, we're there in the beginning and at the onset building resilience. We're there during transit, providing services and protection. We're there in host countries, and we're often there when actually people have to return to their communities to help them address issues of vulnerability. And because of that, we've become a trusted face, a trusted partner. In fact, a few months ago, we're told a story of a mother getting ready to engage in this journey who tells her 12-year-old daughter, if we get separated, look for this symbol. And they do get separated, and they reach out. The daughter reaches out to one of our volunteers, and eventually they're brought back together. So the issue of trust and the issue of a face and a friendly face that you recognize became essential. In Europe last year, despite the fact that we had nearly 90,000 volunteers deployed, the need for information was constant. And that's when we sat and worked with IBM to develop a solution. But what's interesting about this partnership is that we went beyond the usual transactional relationships that organizations like ours usually have. And IBM actually embedded senior staff to really learn and understand the problem and go beyond what we thought we needed to help us develop an application that would actually provide every single refugee or migrant with real-time information and the trusted brand, allowing them to find resources, to find health services when they need it, to know routes that they would have to avoid because they've been closed. So in real life, they had access to this virtual volunteer, providing them with real-time and trusted information, which, as we know, is critical for people that are in these very difficult circumstances.
And I'm sorry, has it been?
Yes,
it's
we have
rolled
actually.
out?
We're piloting it right now in Greece, and we hope to scale up very quickly in other countries.
So I want to ask you the reverse of the question that I just asked before, which is that you usually ask the private sector about how hard it is to work with the multilateral organization. So as a public international organization, what were your challenges in working with the private sector to produce this app?
And actually, it's been an incredible experience, again, because we went...
I thought you might say that.
No, because we went beyond, and this is something that we want to actually model with other partners, because IBM had committed to, again, really working with us to think through the solutions. You know, very quickly, my old friend and boss, Paul Farmer, talks of this concept of accompaniment, which I like. And he basically says that accompaniment is a commitment to supporting an individual during a difficult time throughout a journey from beginning to end. And what we found in this crisis is that these migrants really need this level of accompaniment. But what I found with IBM, actually, is another version of the accompaniment. They've actually sat with us throughout the process and providing us with the critical accompaniment we need to think through the solution. It's been an incredible experience.
Thank you. Blair, you led the writing of the U.S. National Broadband Plan and have talked with other countries about their plans. We've heard all the great things that can come from connectivity, but we've also heard that there is a lack of connectivity for many refugees. What do the broadband plans that you've worked on teach us about how to better connect refugees?
So there have been about 151 countries that have done national broadband plans. They all attempt to answer three fundamental questions. They're all questions that are fundamentally about market failure. That is to say, there's an access gap. Markets won't get networks everywhere. There's an adoption gap. They won't get them at both prices, and also there's a training and relevance component. And there's a usage gap. How do you better deliver public goods and services over the network? That's what our plan did. That's what pretty much all of these plans do. The strategies and tactics depend on where a country is. There are all kinds of different things about spectrum policy and deployments and all kinds of different things. But at the end of the day, most of them rely very heavily on government changing rules and doing things like universal service obligations. None of them, I would note, rely on philanthropy. Now, that's not to say philanthropy doesn't play a role. It does in some minor ways, but philanthropy doesn't match up well against the challenge of the scale of the problem, the CapEx, OpEx obligations of companies to provide the services. It's not usually seen as sustainable. What's interesting about the refugee thing, the problem is the three questions: how do we get networks everywhere? How do we get everybody on? How do we deliver goods and services better? Precisely the same questions. At a strategic and tactical level, you have to answer the question differently. There are political things, such as in the United States. Part of the reason we get networks everywhere is the rural people have political power. That's not necessarily true in refugees. But what is interesting is that there are a variety of things, particularly as we move from a telephone world, which is characterized by monopolists, to a broadband world characterized by competition, in which governments increasingly use what you might think of as market motivations or market forces to solve public problems. We see this with spectrum auctions and other things. But I think that the fundamental lesson you have to have is you have to have a plan. Plan beats no plan. You have to have a group that has an expertise in looking at these three problems and saying, here are a series of tactical things that you can do. Now, what I'm very much struck by is there are so many problems that are mentioned that I think are intractable. This is a very solvable problem. I think first of all, you guys have already done a significant amount of what I would think of as a foundational work for such a plan. And secondly, the scale of such a plan, the deployment, the necessary deployment, we're not talking about billions of dollars. We're talking probably in the neighborhood of hundreds and millions. The adoption problem there, because of adopting people where there's already a network, the marginal cost, I think you'd back me up on this, from Ericsson's point of view. The marginal cost of adding people is so low, there are ways of running reverse auctions that can solve that problem. So this is the solvable problem. And again, it's similar to what you said. Broadband actually doesn't solve any problem. It just makes solving every problem a lot easier and a lot more probabilistic.
Just to follow that, Blair, so to be a little more concrete, how would you propose that the effort be organized to get more refugees online? What does this mean in concrete terms?
Well, of course, the interesting thing is, you have a population that's larger than most countries, 65 million, and unfortunately growing, but you don't have a government jurisdiction that, like the 151 countries, can do this. I think, however, you could easily pull together, writing these plans was not an expensive thing. It requires some funding, but not a lot. And I think you need to have UNHCR, obviously, which is, as I said, in a lot of the foundational work. I think you need to pull in a number of what you might think of as the nonprofits on the ground, because, in fact, there are a number. One of the things you want to do is you want to point to those projects that scale well, and you want to provide some incentives for competitions for whether you're connecting with, futuristic things like drones or you're connecting in the most traditional kinds of ways. But it provide incentives to lower the cost of deployment and adoption. So you want to have those groups that are involved, also involved in writing the plan. You want to have funding. There are folks, and what we've heard from some of the foundations is how they use their own business model to do certain things. There are lots of companies that benefit by more people getting on, and companies that have done an awful lot in these areas and funding them. And I think if you pull those three groups together to then essentially bring in a group whose expertise is on addressing those three problems, networks, adoption, usage, you come up with a plan. And I will simply say that the most important thing with the United States plan was not necessarily our ideas, but rather the reaction to our ideas. We ran a process where we threw things out and then people commented on it. And by the end of basically the 9 months we spent writing it, it was a much better plan, and a lot of the things were adopted. So it's really, how do you create a process that is iterating in the right way, and then by the end of it, there's a big political buy-in from all the relevant groups.
Thanks. And Kelly, I only asked you one question, so I want to go back to you with another question. You've heard about many of these activities already undertaken. You've heard Blair's thoughts on broadband. if you were czar here and could organize all the groups here and also the people sitting there and all these companies, how could they be organized to help UNHCR accomplish the goal that you want here?
Thanks, Alex. Well, I have to say, from our perspective, we can't create the infrastructure, and we don't build the networks. But we've got the presence in 126 countries, and we have over 450 different operations. So we can provide a platform where, and obviously many of those here in this room have been part of that, to try to provide the solutions. I did not give you a concrete example earlier. Let's look at Jordan and how we've used technology in Jordan. It's been impressive, and there have been multiple private sector partners engaged in that. You almost have to take it on a country-by-country approach because you're going to be dealing with different governments, different operating environments, different access levels, different restrictions, different opportunities. In Jordan, we've used iris scanning through mobile telephone networks to be able to put cash into people's hands. And that's been done in a really creative way. We have SMS calling that is done to be able to pass messages about service provision and delivery. Obviously, all of these various tools we don't do by ourselves. So we have a number of partners coming in with solutions to these particular aspects and elements. Talked about education, for example, key part in terms of protection and how we are able to use technology to be able to make it possible for people to protect themselves. So in terms of a platform, I think we've got the beginning of a strategy. It's rather modest, actually, in terms of the price tag at this point. What comes to is the delivery and the broader delivery. And I think, Blair, you're right. It's an absolutely solvable problem. We need to do it together.
So I see, Lars Vig, you have your banner up here from IBM. We have about 10 minutes for questions from way back. You're not excluded. If you have a hand up, we can recognize you and get you a microphone, or for people around the table. So, Lars, over to you.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to fill in what Garry just said about our collaboration here between IBM and IFRC, and it's really been a pleasure to work together and in a truly collaborative manner. And I think this could be a model, as also Garry said, by closing the gap between the funds and the real value which could be created here. But this wouldn't have been possible, let's say, only 5 or 10 years ago, because right now technology is really cheap and fast. Before, you had to put in a number of years and $100 million of doing those kind of things. But right now, the value is, or the cost, as I was related to this kind of projects, it's creativity and working together. And also, we have, over the years in IBM, we have developed a number of assets or platforms that we reuse here. So we don't build things from scratch, in fact. So we take benefit from things that already exists, whether it would be emergency management platforms or cloud capabilities, etc. That's already in place. And we have, in fact, done those investments in other commercial kind of projects. But in this case, we take benefit from those, and therefore we don't have to make actual business profits in those kind of. So this is more of a, let's call it, we have the purpose for IBM, that's to be essential for the world. Could sound a little bit ostentatious maybe, but this is really part of our business model. So working together in small teams, really focused on real value, closing the gap between the funds and what's good for the refugees and for their future lives. That's really the purpose of us being here.
Thank you. Hans, did you want to come back in?
I just want to come back to a couple of challenges in this private-public, and this is more a general statement. Since the SDGs was approved 1 year ago, I've been meeting governments all around the world. One thing that is clearly when it comes to ICT and new technologies is what you mentioned is the procurement process usually doesn't encourage to buy innovation and new solutions and new technologies because you want to benchmark with a given technology or something. That is sort of a challenge when you start trying to sell or maybe do contribution in kind of a technology that you want to do, or for a refugee camp or for digital education or whatever it can be. And I think that in order to both meet the SDGs as well as getting ICT into refugees and migration challenges, it also needs to be an open way to procure this. And I think that private companies are very open to do contribution in kind, meaning I use my great employees, as you said, the cost is really, we're replicating something that we have. That process to actually procure or take that, it's very difficult for the UN and for government as well. Both for a competence point of view and that the procurement process is not set there. And I think that that's something, I mean, you can talk about a lot of consortia and joint ventures and all of that, but ultimately it has to be a transparent process that you're going to use a technology or something, and you need to be able to actually buy solution that is not on the shelf, that has not been done before, or new technologies. And I think that's something that we need to really overcome in order to use ICT in general for all these humanitarian challenges and for the 17 SDGs. And I think that's something we all need to think about how we solve.
Yeah, that's important. I want to distinguish here between UN organizations buying services that they use for people, as opposed to just as opposed to increasing connectivity in general, where people with mobile devices can then get access. Because if I understood Blair correctly, I don't think he was describing a process where money came to UNHCR or to others, but rather running a set of processes where companies together, with the help of governments willing perhaps to lower regulatory burdens or other kinds of things, would then open up a market which might require some private money to get that going, and might require UNHCR's work with the government to help persuade them that it's a good thing to get more refugees on, but it actually wouldn't be a procurement process for UNHCR. Hans, and then
if I just can respond to that, I mean, all the sort of forecasting we're doing on deploying standard technology in the world right now is actually indicating that by 2021, it's only, I'm not sure I can use the word only, 300 million people on Earth that will not have a broadband coverage. But it's still going to be 1.4 billion that's not going to use it. And the reason is, of course, as we heard, infrastructure. You need energy. Even though you have coverage, you don't have energy to charge your phone. You need content that is relevant and understand to use it. And ultimately, the device, whatever device it is, has to come down even further in price. And then we should know for every $10 you reduce the price on a smartphone, 100 million people more on Earth can buy it. That's the purchasing power of it. So I think that, yes, I agree that the broadband plans are essential. I worked in the Broadband Commission myself, and I'm extremely, but that we see happening. I think there's other things that we need to address. I mean, the 1.4 billion people that 2021 will have more broadband coverage will not use it. How do we address that?
Okay. Sorry. Niraj, you've got your flag up, and then I'll turn to Blair, and then IOM.
So just building up on what Hans said about innovation and co-creation. So let's take the next step of working with the multilateral organizations, and you actually co-create and innovate. But what happens is it comes to a stop after that, because then the multilateral organizations need to figure out funding and permissions from the government to roll out on a larger scale. And we see then it comes to a grinding halt, and then to your point earlier, you're talking years before something, and by then the innovation is old. So we also need to think once we go down the path of co-creation and innovation, how do you then really take it to market quickly and not wait years, because then it's irrelevant.
Blair?
If I could just very quickly add that I completely agree, and I just think that part of the planning process would be to tie these efforts into a variety of other efforts that then lower the cost, both the deployment and adoption. For example, Soros, his announcement today, you can't invest in various enterprises unless those enterprises have some kind of connectivity. And so you want to tie that in. You want to tie it into the kind of things that the President of the United States is saying. You want to tie it into certain efforts of the World Bank, too. So part of the challenge is, and again, at the vision level, it's very similar to national broadband plans. At the tactical level, it's got to be totally different, and that's the challenge.
You want to connect connectivity. Okay, I get it. Okay. IOM.
Thank you very much, Alex, and fascinating discussion. Just wanted to very briefly share an experience from IOM perspective. Recently, we conducted a very brief survey among the refugees and migrants who were crossing the Mediterranean. And we asked those who were surveyed what were their most urgent and immediate needs. And it wasn't food, shelter, water, clothes, but it was where can I charge my mobile? And that was quite revealing. And this is also very relevant to our discussion here, the connectivity and the force of technology that is available to us. We do not have any reason to be complacent and not work together to bring that connectivity, the power of technology to help ourselves to provide those solutions to the refugees and migrants. That's very important. In that regard, just leave it out here for your notice that in IOM we are about to launch a migration application, MIGAP as it's called, to reach out to hundreds of millions of migrants to provide essential basic information in many areas to prevent irregular migration, to support and provide the policies and programs that are available for regulating migration. So we're talking to many different private sector companies, and many discussions that happen today I think are relevant to us, and we'll be more than happy to talk to any one of you. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got just 2 minutes left in the panel. I see one question here and a quick comment by Lars. If you can literally keep this to a minute, that would be great. In the back.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you for the conversation. My name is Lauren Woodman, and I work with an organization called NetHope. I'm going to echo IOM's comments. NetHope is a consortium of the world's largest 49 humanitarian organizations in the technology industry. We've been setting up Wi-Fi and charging stations all along the migration route, and it's the #1 questions that migrants ask us. To sum up some of the questions of earlier panelists, there is a real commitment on behalf of many of the international nonprofits that are working in the refugee space to work collaboratively to share these types of solutions, to figure out the most rapidly deployable technologies, how we use them, and then how we benefit the communities in which that are welcoming refugee populations. The question I would have back to this distinguished panel sitting around the table is, how do we better coordinate that amongst the private sector? Because we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out and working with all of the technology partners how to bring those solutions to our members, who then do the hard work themselves of figuring out how to share those solutions across their respective organizations in the places that they work. And if you look at some of the work that we've done with UNHCR and wiring in Zatri and Azraq and previously in the Dadaab camps to bring greater connectivities, that ultimately results in better connectivity at lower prices for both the organizations that are working there and the people that they're trying to serve. So I hope that there's an action item coming out of this as to how we can better coordinate those activities so that we can make those connections so that we can solve this connectivity problem, which is ultimately a very solvable problem.
Yeah, exactly. There will be an action item coming out, and there'll be several, and that will need to be one of them. Thank you for that. Lars, you get 10 seconds for a final comment here.
Right. Okay. I'll make it in 10 seconds. I'd like to be a little bit provocative or maybe forward-looking here. We talked a lot about public procurement here and the limitation based on that. I talked before about what was not possible 5-10 years ago. I think for the coming 5 years, 10 years, we will see more about ecosystems, not this linear buying-seller methodology, but more forming ecosystems, creating values for us. For example, in IBM, we are existing in 170 countries. We need the talent and the competence from those refugees landing in different countries. So that could be our benefit, in fact, of creating value together, and then we share the value produced in those kind of projects, instead of the traditional buying and selling method.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on one word that Garry used, accompaniment, which I think of as a word that I learned when I worked at a Jesuit university. There's something very powerful about that word, and it's a nicer word than partnership even, isn't it? That this is something we accompany each other on this journey. And the partnerships we've described here between IFRC and IBM, Vodafone and UNHCR and WFP, Ericsson and Gates and other UN organizations, these are very powerful models of how to move forward here. And hopefully we can get to our NetHope friends' question about how do we coordinate these efforts really to help some of the most disadvantaged people in the world and help UNHCR achieve its goal of connectivity for all. So thank you all for being here. The next panel will start in 2 minutes, we have a very important panel on private sponsorship of resettlement. Minister McCallum is with us, but he's here only for a very short period of time, so we need to start really in just 2 minutes' time. So please don't go far while we rearrange the table. Thank you very much.